You ever notice how strange sleep feels sometimes? How the world goes quiet, the air changes texture, and your thoughts start wandering into odd corners of memory and dream. Tonight, we're diving into that quiet but not the sleep you know. Because in the Middle Ages, people didn't just drift off for 8 hours straight under soft blankets. No, their nights were divided, noisy, holy, itchy, and sometimes shared with livestock. Welcome to the weird ways medieval people slept. Before we begin, go ahead and make yourself comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. If you've got a candle nearby, light it, let it flicker, just enough to make the room feel a little older, a little quieter. Maybe turn on a fan, or let some soft background sound hum behind you. This story isn't just meant to be heard, it's meant to be felt. Tonight, we'll walk backward through time, to a world where the dark was deeper, the nights longer, and sleep itself was a fragile, sacred thing. And before we settle in, just a small favour. If you enjoy these calm journeys into strange corners of the past, you can subscribe, but only if it feels right. It really helps us keep the candles burning here. And I always like to ask, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? It's fascinating to imagine all of us scattered across the world, gathered around this one quiet story. Now close your eyes for a moment and picture it. The year is 1340. You're in a small village somewhere in northern Europe. Outside your cottage, the last light has faded. There are no street lamps, no screens, no hum of electricity, just darkness, complete and heavy, pressing against the windows. Inside, the air smells faintly of smoke, old wood, and straw. The hearth has burned low, a slow orange glow flickering over rough walls. You hear the wind slipping through the cracks, a soft whistle that never quite stops. This is bedtime, but not the kind you know. For medieval people, night was its own small world, a world filled with rituals, fears, and superstitions. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was a crossing, the moment between life and death, body and spirit, warmth and cold. Every time you closed your eyes, you surrendered to a mystery you couldn't control. So before anyone even thought about lying down, there were preparations to be made. The fire was banked carefully, because if it went out, the house would freeze by morning. The door was barred with wood or iron, not just against thieves or wolves, but against things people believed might come from the dark spirits, wandering souls, or the devil himself. Children whispered prayers learned by heart small, protective charms disguised as bedtime verses, and parents muttered longer ones, the kind meant to keep the soul tethered safely until dawn. Then came the awkward ritual of getting ready for bed, though that phrase meant something entirely different. You wouldn't find anyone slipping into cotton, pajamas, or brushing their teeth. Most people slept in the same clothes they'd worked in, maybe loosening a belt or removing shoes if they were lucky enough to have any. The smell of sweat, smoke, and hay clung to everyone. And if you were poor, your bed wasn't really a bed at all, just a flattened pile of straw known as a pallet. Still, after a day of hard labour grinding grain, hauling water, tending animals, that straw must have felt like heaven. The body gave in easily, the mind slower. And yet, medieval people didn't sleep straight through the night. Their rest came in two halves, first sleep and second sleep, separated by an hour or two of quiet waking. That part of the story's segmented sleep is where we're heading next. But before we reach it, it's worth pausing here, at this threshold between waking and dreaming. Because medieval nights were alive in ways that might surprise you. Darkness wasn't just absence, it was an entire landscape. Without light pollution, the stars burned like small fires in the sky. The moon cast strange shapes through thin windows of horn or oiled parchment. Dogs barked in the distance, maybe at nothing, maybe at something you couldn't see. Inside, someone might cough, stir, or shift in their sleep. Maybe the baby cried. Maybe a hen fluttered on the floorboards. And you'd pull the rough blanket up to your chin and listen, waiting for silence to settle again. There's a beauty in imagining that world, slower, rawer, but somehow more connected. People then didn't think of night as an inconvenience to push through. It was a sacred pause, a time for reflection, prayer, even conversation. Neighbours could sometimes see each other's firelight through gaps in their shutters and know they weren't alone. Sleep was communal, social even. In large households, several people shared the same bed, children, parents, servants, maybe a cousin passing through. The idea of personal space hadn't been invented yet. Warmth was survival. And yet, for all its closeness, the medieval night could also feel vast and isolating. People believed the soul wandered during sleep, drifting out into unseen realms. Dreams weren't meaningless, they were messages, warnings, temptations. To sleep was to risk something. That's why so many prayers began with a version of the same plea, "If I should die before I wake," a line we still say without realizing how ancient it really is. But don't worry, we're not staying in the gloom tonight. We're here to wander through this strange, candle-lit world with curiosity, not fear. Over the next chapters, we'll slip quietly into their bedrooms, their monasteries, their inns, and their superstitions. We'll see what it meant to share a bed with strangers, to wear a hat to sleep, to pray against demons, to doze beside your livestock, or to scratch away the company of bedbugs. Every detail, as weird as it sounds, reveals something true about how humans have always tried, desperately, ingeniously, to rest in a restless world. So take one more deep breath, let the candle flicker lower. Imagine the faint creak of a wooden bed frame, the rustle of straw under tired bodies, the soft murmur of prayer. Outside, the village fades into silence. A rooster stirs somewhere too early, confused by the moonlight, and you like them begin to drift. But just as sleep begins to take you, a thought flickers. In the Middle Ages, this was only half the night. Soon, you'd wake again, hours before dawn, to tend the fire, whisper to your spouse, or stare into the dark in quiet reflection. Sleep was not one long dream, it was two journeys, separated by an hour of waking life. And that, perhaps, is the strangest thing of all. Maybe their way of sleeping, divided, rhythmic, patient, wasn't so strange after all. Maybe it was natural. Maybe we're the ones who forgot. When you finally drifted off in a medieval bed, if we can call it that, the night didn't unfold in one smooth stretch. It came in waves, like the tide. The first sleep carried you down into heavy darkness, thick as wool. For roughly 4 hours, your mind sank deep, your breathing slowed, and the world outside disappeared. But then, like clockwork, your body woke up not by accident, not from restlessness, but because that was what it was meant to do. This rhythm, known as segmented sleep, was the heartbeat of the medieval night. The first slumber began shortly after dusk, when fires dimmed and chores ended. Candles and rushlights were precious, so people turned in early, sometimes as soon as the sun slipped behind the trees. The second sleep came only after a curious interlude, a waking hour or two in the middle of the night, a time the French once called dorveille, the watch. Imagine this. You stir in the dark, heart steady, body rested but not finished. The embers of the hearth glow faintly, like tiny eyes in the corner of the room. Someone nearby shifts under a blanket. You can hear the soft crackle of cooling wood, the breath of a sleeping child, maybe a low grunt from the pig penned near the door. And though the world outside lies frozen and black, this hour feels strangely alive. In towns and monasteries, bells sometimes marked this in-between period. Monks rose for matins, the midnight prayers, voices echoing in stone chapels while peasants murmured their own private devotions at home. Some people used this time to read religious texts or recite psalms from memory, their lips moving softly in the glow of a single candle stub. Others whispered together, sharing gossip or confessing worries that daylight never permitted, but not all of it was solemn. Medieval writings hint that this watch between sleeps was also when intimacy often happened. Physicians and marriage guides even recommended it. They said the body, refreshed from its first rest, was, in its best and calmest state, neither weary nor distracted. So, if you'd been waiting for the right time to conceive a child, this was your window. Somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, while the rest of the village lay quiet, the holy hour doubled as the romantic one. If you weren't particularly pious or romantic, you might instead get up to tend to practical matters. The family fire had to be checked, ashes stirred so the flame could survive until dawn. A leaking roof or unsettled animals might need attention. The night watch offered a chance to make sure your world hadn't collapsed while you slept. In a sense, it was an hour of maintenance, physical, domestic, and spiritual, before surrendering again to the second sleep. For the rich, the ritual took a different tone. Nobles and courtiers in drafty manor houses sometimes passed the middle hours with conversation, light reading, or quiet music. They could afford to burn a candle or two, a luxury symbol of both status and insomnia. Diaries and letters from later centuries describe this waking period as almost serene, a soft island of calm before the second tide of dreams. Servants might stoke the fires or bring warm, spiced wine. For a brief time, even the great halls of castles were hushed and intimate, shadows dancing on the carved beams above. What's fascinating is how normal this pattern was. Medieval people didn't consider it strange to wake in the middle of the night. It wasn't restlessness, it wasn't insomnia, it was the schedule. A farmer might rise from his straw pallet, sit by the hearth to mend a tool, pray for his crops, or just watch the sparks in silence. A mother might nurse her child, a shepherd check on the flock, a monk kneel on cold stone floors whispering Latin verses. And when the body began to tire again, when the second drowsiness arrived like a tide returning, they'd lie down for the second sleep, often until sunrise. Even literature of the time reflected it. Writers like Chaucer mentioned first and second, sleeps as casually as we might mention breakfast or lunch. Nobody thought twice about it. Doctors even wrote advice for maintaining a healthy interval waking. They believed that sleep, like all bodily functions, should follow the rhythm of nature, not a block, but a balance, a breathing in and out of wakefulness. Modern scientists, looking back, have found that this old rhythm actually fits the human body surprisingly well. In total darkness without clocks, screens, or streetlights, the body naturally settles into two halves of rest, separated by gentle wakefulness. It's called biphasic sleep, and experiments have shown it happens even today when people live without artificial light. The human brain, it seems, was built for the medieval night. So what changed? Industrialization, that eternal villain of quiet lives. As cities grew and factories demanded fixed schedules, sleep had to become efficient, uninterrupted, timed. The concept of 8 hours of solid rest was born not from nature, but from necessity. The gentle, candlelit intermission between first and second sleep vanished beneath gas lamps, clocks, and later, the electric glow that keeps our nights permanently half awake. Still, imagining it feels strangely peaceful. Waking softly in the dark, knowing everyone else was doing the same, not to check a phone, but to think, to pray, to simply be. There's a kind of intimacy in that collective stillness. In those hours, you weren't expected to produce or rush. You could talk quietly with your spouse, stir the fire, or just listen to the rain on the roof and know that you still had another sleep waiting. But, of course, not every night was peaceful. Sometimes the waking hour brought unease. If a child coughed too long, or the wind moaned against the shutters, people took it as a sign. The devil was busy at night, they said, tempting dreamers, slipping through cracks, stirring fears. Some families kept protective charms near their beds, iron scissors, a cross, even herbs like rosemary or street. John's wort, believed to keep demons and nightmares at bay. A few whispered that the hour between sleeps was when witches roamed, when the boundary between worlds was thinnest. Better to whisper a prayer and lie still than to tempt whatever listened beyond the walls. Yet even fear had its rhythm. Eventually, the candle guttered out. The fire's glow softened into ash. One by one, the family settled back into quiet breathing, the second sleep wrapping them like a tide returning to shore. Outside, frost gathered on the thatch. Somewhere in the fields, an owl called once, twice, then was gone. By dawn, when the rooster finally crowed, it was as if that middle hour had never happened, a secret shared by the night itself. But you could feel it in the calm of the morning, in the quiet steadiness of people who had already lived 2 lives before sunrise, one of work and one of rest. So as you lie there now, imagining that distant world, think about your own nights. How many times have you woken at 2 or 3 a.m., heart racing, mind wandering, and thought something was wrong with you? Maybe nothing's wrong at all. Maybe, for just a moment, your body remembers. By now, you've survived the first and second sleeps, the long, candle-lit rhythm of the medieval night. But before we drift further, let's talk about where all this sleeping actually happened. Because if you're imagining a warm feather mattress, clean sheets, and a soft pillow, brace yourself. The medieval bed was less of a sanctuary and more of a temporary truce between your body and gravity. For most people, sleep happened on what was called a pallet, a pile of straw, reeds, or dried rushes spread across the floor. Sometimes the straw was stuffed into a rough linen sack, if you were lucky enough to own one. If not, it was just laid. directly on the ground, with a thin blanket or your own cloak as cover. It wasn't luxurious, but it was better than nothing, which, for many, was the only alternative. You might picture it now, the flickering orange light of a dying fire, casting shadows across the room, and a family gathered on the floor around it. Parents, children, perhaps an elderly grandparent, everyone together, wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared. The air would have smelled of wood smoke, sweat, and the faint sourness of straw that had seen too many nights. If you shifted the wrong way, it crunched under you like brittle paper. And if you listened closely, you could hear it whispering not from ghosts, but from the small, six-legged company that came free with every bale, because straw beds were alive, not metaphorically. Fleas, lice, and the occasional mouse treated them like a luxury resort. Medieval people didn't have vacuum cleaners, washing machines, or insect spray. Cleaning a bed meant dragging it outside, beating it with a stick, and hoping the sunlight embarrassed the vermin into leaving. Most of them didn't. So when you went to sleep, you didn't just share your bed with your family, you shared it with the entire local ecosystem. If the straw grew too filthy, it was replaced, usually once or twice a year. In some homes, fresh herbs were scattered through it, lavender, tansy, rosemary, partly to mask the smell, partly because they were believed to repel insects. A medieval person might sleep with their head close to a bundle of mint or thyme, the scent rising through the night air, mixing with the smoke of the fire and the faint dampness of the room. It must have been strange and oddly comforting all at once, a world of living smells, all woven into the same dream. Those who could afford a little more comfort raised their pallets off the ground on wooden frames, crude and creaky. It didn't make the bed much softer, but it offered two luxuries, a bit of warmth and a smaller chance of waking up with a beetle in your ear. Some of these early bed frames had ropes strung across the middle to support the mattress. The ropes would sag over time, so people tightened them regularly. That's where the old saying comes from, sleep tight. Still, no matter how tight the ropes, no one was getting much beauty rest. If the fire went out, the cold crept in like a patient animal. If you rolled too far to the side, you might find yourself face first in straw, or, worse, the chamber pot. Bedding was precious, so families shared what they had. Children slept crosswise at the foot of the parents' bed, bundled together like puppies. If you woke up too warm, you rolled closer to the door. Too cold, and you inched toward the fire, praying not to kick over a spark. For the wealthy, though, sleep was a statement, an act of performance. Noble households owned elaborate beds with carved wooden posts, thick feather mattresses, and embroidered sheets. They were raised high off the ground, sometimes so high you needed steps to climb in. Curtains hung around the frame to block drafts, and perhaps to hide a few questionable bedtime activities. These grand beds weren't just for sleeping, they were symbols of power and inheritance. Families listed them in wills. You might not get your uncle's land, but you could inherit his suspiciously lumpy feather bed. Of course, even a feather mattress came with complications. Goose feathers flattened quickly, and the fine down leaked through the fabric, tickling the skin. Servants had to beat and fluff them constantly, replacing the feathers every few years. The wealthy slept in lay as a straw base, then a feather mattress, topped with furs or wool blankets, and finally sheets made of linen. The linen was usually coarse, rarely washed, and often dyed to hide stains. Comfort was relative. Some royal beds were masterpieces. Henry VIII's was said to be wide enough for 6, with velvet hangings and gilded posts. But beneath the silk and embroidery, the same problems lingered: lice, fleas, and the stench of unwashed humanity. Even kings couldn't escape that particular democracy. They just suffered it in fancier surroundings. It's strange, isn't it? In an age obsessed with comfort, it's hard to imagine a world where sleep was an act of endurance. Yet, for medieval people, that was life. Sleep wasn't meant to be luxurious, it was meant to be survived. You lay down not expecting to rest perfectly, but hoping to wake up at all. Still, the bed, however humble, was the heart of the home. It was where babies were born and the sick lay dying. It was where prayers were whispered, where secrets were shared, where warmth was found in a world that offered little of it. The bed wasn't just furniture, it was witness. It held every stage of a person's life, and when that life ended, the same bed often held their body for its final vigil. If you were poor, your bed might be nothing but straw and sorrow. but you'd still crawl into it every night, pull your rough blanket close, and try to find peace. You'd listen to the soft breathing of your family, the quiet rustle of animals nearby, and maybe, just maybe, the tiny sound of the straw settling, a soft reminder that even in the hardest times, there was still a place to rest. And for those few with coin to spare, there was one final indulgence, something we still use today, though the meaning has changed completely. Before you blew out your candle, you reached for your nightcap, not a drink, but a hat. A long, floppy piece of wool or linen, worn to keep your head warm when the rest of your body hid beneath scratchy blankets. Because in a world of stone walls and howling drafts, even your scalp needed armor. But that, my friend, is where we'll go next. Because the medieval night wasn't only cold, it was fashionably cold. By the time the fire faded to its last dull glow, the chill in a medieval house could cut like a blade. You could pile on furs, wrap yourself in wool, and bury half your face in a scratchy blanket, but one part of the body was still exposed, your head. And that's where one of the strangest, coziest, and somehow most enduring medieval sleep habits was born: the nightcap. Now, when we hear the word today, most of us picture a small glass of whiskey or brandy before bed, a drink to warm the bones and soften the edges of the day. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't something you drank, it was something you wore. And not just a modest accessory either, we're talking about long, drooping hats that looked like something between a wizard's cap and a festive sock. The logic behind it was brutally practical. Medieval homes, even wealthy ones, were cold. Drafty stone walls trapped moisture, roofs leaked. Windows, when they existed at all, were made from oiled parchment or thin slices of animal horn that barely kept. Out the wind. A fire helped, but it couldn't heat an entire room, and it certainly couldn't chase the chill from the far corner where your bed stood. Central heating was centuries away. The closest equivalent was a loyal dog curled up near your feet. People genuinely believed, and with some reason, that a great deal of body heat escaped through the head. So they covered it. Men wore soft wool caps or linen wraps that tied under the chin. Women used coifs or veils that stayed in place as they slept. A good nightcap could mean the difference between waking up refreshed or stiff-necked and half-frozen, and in a society where a winter cold could turn fatal, such details mattered. Picture it now: a flickering candle, a wooden bed frame creaking under the weight of straw and feathers, and a tired peasant tying a strip of cloth under his chin, like a knight preparing for battle. The cap droops to one side, slightly ridiculous, but effective. His wife wraps her hair in linen, the children huddle under a single woolen blanket, and above them, the rafters whistle with the wind. The fire has shrunk to a whisper of orange, but no one complains. The nightcap is their only shield against the cold, and it does its job. Of course, not all nightcaps were equal. For peasants, it was usually whatever scrap of fabric they could spare, old shirts cut apart, worn-out cloth twisted into makeshift wraps. But for the wealthy, the nightcap became a small but telling luxury. The softest linen, imported from Flanders or Italy, might be lined with fur or embroidered with thread of gold. A nobleman's nightcap wasn't just functional, it was fashionable. And there were rules to it. In some regions, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, even while asleep. To be seen bareheaded, even in private, could be considered indecent. The nightcap, then, wasn't just a layer of warmth, it was a symbol of virtue, modesty, and social rank. Imagine waking up, beside your husband, the frost still clinging to the windows, and before you say a word, you adjust your head wrap just so, because propriety doesn't rest, not even at midnight. For men, the cap was also a marker of off-duty hours. In paintings and plays, a man shown in his nightcap was not meant for business or battle. He was home, relaxed, vulnerable, human. To open the door while still wearing it was the medieval equivalent of answering your boss's call in your pajamas. A clear, polite signal that the conversation should be brief. In some towns, men even joked that if you answered the door in a cap, you had every right to refuse guests. The message was simple: I'm not dressed for conversation, and yes, this hat means go away. Then there's the shape, that iconic, drooping cone with the long tail. Sometimes, that tail had a small tassel or knot at the end. Historians aren't sure why. Maybe it helped tie the cap in place. Maybe it was just decorative. Either way, it became a defining silhouette of medieval sleep. You can still picture it now, can't you? The exaggerated, cartoonish cap trailing off the bed as its wearer snores beside a sputtering candle. Interestingly, the nightcap also carried meaning beyond warmth and status. In colder months, people feared that the chill could seep into the brain, causing madness, fever, or even death. Covering the head was seen as protection against these unseen dangers. Physicians, the ones still juggling theories about humours and leeches, recommended it as a form of health maintenance. Keep the head covered in sleep, they'd say, lest the vapours of the brain be disordered. It sounds absurd now, but given the conditions, it probably worked better than most of their other advice. And of course, there were the aesthetic challenges. In communal sleeping arrangements, inns, monasteries, or shared family rooms, the nightcap was both a necessity and a small embarrassment. Imagine sharing a bed with two strangers after a long journey, pulling your nightcap over your ears and trying to ignore the snores beside you. You can't help but notice how everyone's hat says something about them. The wealthy merchant's is freshly laundered and perfumed with lavender. The pilgrim's smells faintly of sheep. The farmer's is patched 3 times over. And yet, in the dim light, they all look the same, a strange little army of fabric peaks nodding toward dreamland. In the colder monasteries of northern Europe, monks wore their cowls to bed, the same hoods attached to their robes. But some monasteries had strict rules. No extra cloth, no indulgence. Those monks simply pulled the rough wool over their heads, whispering their last prayers and hoping the Lord would forgive their teeth chattering through the night. The nightcap's reign lasted for centuries. It appears in paintings, diaries, even laws. In later eras, it evolved into a fashion statement, trimmed with lace, ribbon, and fine embroidery. By the 17th century, it was so iconic that it became shorthand for bedtime itself. You can see it in every old Christmas illustration, from Dickens's Scrooge to countless sleepy peasants, that long, flopping cap trailing into history like the last ember of a forgotten fire. And then, slowly, it vanished. The rise of chimneys and enclosed hearths made rooms warmer, glass windows became common, and houses finally sealed against drafts. Nightcaps migrated from heads to history books, replaced by something far more modern, the nightcap drink. The ritual of warmth remained just in a different form. What once kept you from freezing now helps you unwind. But if you think the medieval bedtime routine ends there, think again. Because the real adventure didn't happen in the safety of your own bed. The true test of medieval sleep came when you left home when you travelled. Inns and hostels offered a kind of hospitality that would make even the bravest modern traveller sleep with one eye open. So far, you've survived the straw beds, the cold stone rooms, and the indignity of sleeping with a hat tied under your chin. But if you were a traveller in the Middle Ages, a merchant, a pilgrim, or just an unlucky soul whose mule had given up halfway to Norwich, things were about to get a lot worse. Because once you left home, your bed stopped being yours at all. Inns were rare, expensive, and almost never comfortable. A sign advertising lodging didn't mean you were getting your own room, it meant you were getting a place to lie down, possibly indoors, almost certainly beside people you'd never met. Medieval inns were more like human storage rooms than cosy retreats. Beds were communal. If there was space for one more body, you took it, no questions asked. Picture this. You stumble through the inn's crooked doorway after a long, freezing day on the road. The air inside hits you smoke, sweat, wet wool, and ale. A few candles flicker along the walls, their light catching on wooden beams blackened by centuries of soot. Behind the counter, the innkeeper looks up from his mug and nods toward a staircase. You pay your few coins, climb the creaking steps, and push open a door to the dormitory. Inside, the room is crowded. Straw-stuffed mattresses line the floor, some already occupied. Boots are scattered everywhere. A dog snores near the hearth, and someone's singing in their sleep. You find a patch of space beside two strangers. One smells like horse, the other like pickled fish, and you realise this is it, your bed for the night. For travellers, bed sharing with strangers wasn't just common, it was expected. The concept of private rooms was reserved for nobles or clergy. Everyone else, from merchants to messengers, slept shoulder to shoulder. It was practical, if not exactly pleasant. Beds were valuable real estate. Why waste a good mattress on one person when it could fit 3 or 4? Contemporary accounts mention travellers packed so tightly they could hardly turn over. In larger inns, long wooden frames held enormous mattresses where up to half a dozen guests would lie side by side. There was no choosing your neighbour. You could end up beside a bishop, a beggar, or a thief, and sometimes all three at once. Etiquette in these situations was simple. Mind your space, keep your purse close, and don't ask questions. Travellers often slept with their money belts tied tight or even stuffed under their clothes. Some turned their bags into makeshift pillows to deter pickpockets. A common trick was to loop one's arm through the strap of a satchel while pretending to be asleep, a quiet signal that you'd rather not be robbed. Of course, that didn't stop determined thieves, but it made them work harder for it. The risk of theft was only part of the adventure. There were also the noises. Imagine a room filled with 10 or 12 snoring bodies, each breathing at a different rhythm. Add to that the coughing, the occasional bout of drunken singing, the restless scratching of fleas, and the constant creak of wood under shifting weight. The smell alone could flatten a strong man. The combination of damp clothes, unwashed bodies, and spilled ale created an atmosphere that was equal parts human and barnyard. And yet, in a strange way, this was community. You might share a blanket with a pilgrim heading to Canterbury, or a soldier on leave from some far-off garrison. There were stories exchanged, whispered prayers, and the unspoken understanding that you were all, for that night at least, fellow survivors. Some travellers even found it comforting, a reminder that in the cold, uncertain dark, no one truly slept alone. Not every inn kept the sexes apart, though many claimed to. In theory, men and women were given separate quarters. In practice, space and money decided everything. In busy market towns, it wasn't uncommon for a woman to find herself squeezed between two men she didn't know, her modesty protected only by exhaustion and the sheer practicality of survival. It wasn't considered scandalous, just part of the deal. Privacy was a luxury for the rich. To make matters worse, the quality of beds varied wildly. Some inns offered straw pallets, others provided wooden planks or, in desperate times, bare floorboards. The wealthier establishments might boast feather mattresses, but these were rarely cleaned. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in the seams, feeding happily on both nobles and peasants alike. Guests learned quickly not to scratch in public, it gave away where they'd slept. In some towns, beds were assigned by profession, a crude attempt at order. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, merchants with merchants. The logic was that people of similar trades might share better manners or at least better odours. But more often than not, it was first come, first serve. You got what was, left, and if you arrived late, your bed might already be half occupied by someone's boots or a stranger's elbow. If the inn was truly overcrowded, guests slept sitting up against the wall, wrapped in their cloaks. The lucky few near the hearth enjoyed a little warmth, but at a price they'd wake up choking on smoke. Those near the door shivered all night from the cold draughts sneaking through the cracks, and if you dared to complain, the innkeeper would simply shrug. "It's a bed, isn't it?" Not everyone handled the experience gracefully. There are records of brawls breaking out over stolen blankets, snoring contests, or accusations of lice theft. Yes, that was a thing. One French chronicler from the 15th century wrote of two travellers who came to blows when one accused the other of hogging the heat of the fire. The fight ended with both men thrown into the street and the dog taking their bend spot by the hearth. Still, for all its misery, the inn was a blessing compared to the alternative. Sleeping outdoors meant wolves, bandits, and the risk of freezing before dawn. A cramped, smelly room full of strangers suddenly didn't seem so bad when the night wind howled outside, and every so often something unexpectedly kind happened. A fellow traveller shared a crust of bread, a story, or a flask of wine. Someone offered a bit of their cloak to the person beside them. There was a sense of fragile fellowship born of necessity. In those long, uncomfortable nights, people found a quiet sort of solidarity, proof that even in the most unpleasant company, warmth could still be shared. By dawn, the room would come alive again, coughing, stretching, groaning. Boots thumped on the floor, belts buckled, coins clinked as travellers settled their bills. Within minutes, the beds were empty, leaving only the smell of stale ale and the rustle of straw. By nightfall, new travellers would take their place, and the whole strange dance would begin, again. So, the next time you sink into a clean hotel bed, think of your medieval counterpart clutching his purse, sharing a blanket with two strangers, and trying to ignore the faint sound of squeaking fleas. Sleep wasn't a private act back then. It was a communal negotiation with fate. But even after leaving the inns and returning home, people didn't rest easy. Because for medieval minds, sleep wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Each night was a small rehearsal for death, a time when your soul might wander and never return. And that's where we're heading next, into the whispered world of prayers before sleep, where faith met fear in the flickering candlelight, and every good night carried the weight of eternity. When the candle finally burned low and the house fell silent, the medieval night wasn't a time of comfort, it was a time of risk. Sleep wasn't just about rest, it was about surrender. You lay down not knowing if you would ever rise again. For a world without medicine, heating, or guarantees, the line between night and death felt thin enough to touch. And that's why, before closing their eyes, medieval people didn't simply say goodnight, they prayed. Forget lavender sprays or meditation playlists, their bedtime ritual was a full-scale spiritual negotiation. Every soul had to be accounted for before the darkness came. After all, one never knew what might happen between dusk and dawn. You could die in your sleep of fever, fire, or foul spirits. The devil, they believed, worked overtime after sunset. So before the first slumber began, there was business to settle with heaven. Families gathered near the hearth, the last coals glowing red, shadows flickering across the walls. The air smelled faintly of smoke and sheep's wool. The youngest children knelt first, their small voices whispering verses they'd memorized long before they understood their meaning. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. A rhyme that sounds innocent today, but in those days it was deadly serious, a child's first legal agreement with eternity. Parents followed with longer, sterner prayers, lines pulled from psalms, litanies, or saints' devotions. Many began by thanking God for surviving another day of toil and plague, then moved quickly to confession. Because who wanted to die mid-dream with unspoken sins on the ledger? It was, in a way, a nightly audit of the soul. The rich might keep a small crucifix beside their bed. The poor traced the sign of the cross on the wall or even on their blankets. Some whispered invocations to the Virgin Mary, or to local saints known for their vigilance, Saint Michael for protection, Saint Dymphna for sanity, Saint Apollonia if your toothache refused to let you sleep. Once the prayers were done, the room usually fell quiet. There was comfort in the ritual, a rhythm that soothed the mind. The day's work faded, and a softer kind of focus took its place. But beneath that calm was fear, raw and ancient. People truly believed that the night was when invisible battles took place. The soul, wandering freely in dreams, could encounter spirits, angels, or demons. And if it wasn't properly fortified with prayer, it might not return by morning. Priests warned against neglecting bedtime prayers. To skip them, they said, was to invite temptation not just from the devil, but from the body itself. In a world obsessed with sin, even your sleeping thoughts could condemn you. Dreaming of greed, lust, or pride was seen as evidence of moral weakness. Some theologians even debated whether sin committed in dreams counted as real sin. Imagine waking up, shaking your head, and wondering if you'd just earned yourself another confession. The church offered solutions, of course. Devotional manuals listed specific bedtime prayers for every situation. Feeling guilty? Try Psalm 51. Fear of nightmares? Appeal to the Archangel Michael. Travelling? St. Christopher had you covered. There were even prayers against sudden death, the most dreaded kind. In an age of pestilence and house fires, you wanted to die awake, with time for repentance. The idea of slipping away unshriven terrified them, so the night became a sacred zone of preparation. Some monks called it vigil time, when heaven drew close enough to listen. Before sleep, you made peace with the world and with yourself. The bed became both altar and battlefield, the blanket a shroud of humility. For the deeply devout, the ritual extended even further. Monks and nuns ended their days with compline, the final prayer service of the monastic hours. Candles flickered in long stone corridors as chants echoed softly. Protect us, Lord, as we stay awake. Watch over us as we sleep. The words were both plea and surrender. After compline, silence fell. No more talking until morning. If someone snored too loudly, the others endured it in prayerful patience, or tried to. In private homes, bedtime prayers could also be social events. In wealthier households, servants and family members gathered in one room to pray together before dispersing. The lord of the house led the words, his voice rising above the crackling fire. In poorer cottages, the entire family might huddle in one bed, murmuring prayers in half-sleep while the wind moaned outside. And for children, the prayers doubled as bedtime stories, but these weren't the comforting tales of fairies and magic. They were warnings. Parents told them that angels watched over good sleepers, while the wicked might find a demon perched on their chest, pressing down until they couldn't breathe. That's where the term nightmare comes from, the Mara, an evil spirit said to ride people in their sleep. To protect against it, some families left small offerings of bread or milk near the hearth, hoping to distract whatever prowled the night. Even the architecture of sleep reflected this, spiritual anxiety. Beds were often positioned so that the sleeper's head faced east, toward the direction of the rising sun, a subtle nod to resurrection. Dying in that position was said to make it easier for the soul to find its way to heaven. In some regions, people even avoided sleeping with their feet pointing west, believing it mimicked the posture of the dead. The faith that fueled these rituals wasn't just fear, it was also hope. Hope that by saying the right words, you could anchor yourself against the dark. That if death came while you slept, it would find you ready. In a world so fragile, prayer was the one thing that felt solid. But even with all their devotion, nightmares still came. People described them vividly. Black hounds with fiery eyes, shadowy figures sitting at the edge of the bed, whispers in the dark. For the medieval mind, these weren't dreams, they were visitations. The line between sleep and the supernatural was thin. A bad dream wasn't random. It was a message. Maybe from God, maybe from something else. And so, in the stillness of the night, when even the dogs stopped barking, you lay awake for a moment after your prayer, eyes open, waiting. You might hear the wind pressing against the shutters, or a log shifting in the hearth, and wonder if something unseen had come calling. You'd pull the blanket tighter, whisper one last plea, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Then, finally, you'd let sleep take you. Of course, not everyone feared dreams. Some believed they were divine, that in sleep, God spoke directly to the soul. There were saints who claimed to receive visions, monks who woke with prophecies, and even ordinary farmers who swore they'd been warned of storms or plagues in their sleep. Dreams could be blessings or traps, but always, they mattered. And that's where our journey turns next, because once your eyes closed and your prayers were said, the real adventures began in your mind. What did medieval people see when they dreamed? What did it mean when angels spoke or demons whispered? Were their dreams holy or haunted? Keep the candle burning low, my friend. We're about to step into the other half of the night, the strange, symbolic world of dreams and divine messages. By now, the candle has burned to its stub, the prayers have been whispered, and the straw has finally gone still. Outside, the night is absolute, a world without hums, headlights, or glowing clocks. Inside, your breathing slows, and at last, sleep takes you. But in the Middle Ages, closing your eyes didn't mean escaping the world. It meant entering another one. To the medieval mind, dreams were never random. They were communications, divine telegrams sent through the subconscious. Every flicker of imagery, every strange encounter, every bizarre twist in the night was interpreted as a message, either from God, the saints, or the devil himself. Sleep was not an escape from, meaning it was a conversation with the unseen. Picture a farmer in the 14th century waking at dawn, the chill of morning air seeping through the shutters. His wife stirs beside him, murmuring about a dream she had, a field of black crows circling over their house. He stiffens. To us, it's just a dream. To him, it's a warning. In his world, crows don't just appear, they mean something. Famine, sickness, or death. Before the fire is even lit, he's already wondering which of the neighbours will fall ill next. Dreams were taken so seriously that entire manuals were written to interpret them. These dream books, some translated from Arabic and Greek sources, offered encyclopedias of symbols. Dream of water? It could mean purification or danger, depending on whether the water was calm or turbulent. Dream of fire? That might mean divine inspiration or hellfire. See gold? You might gain wealth or lose virtue. Dream interpretation was a dangerous game. Meanings changed with context, with faith, with fear. And yet, people played that game constantly. Monks recorded their dreams in journals. Nobles paid priests to analyze them. Even kings consulted dream interpreters before making decisions. One famous example comes from the early 12th century. King Henry I of England reportedly woke in terror after dreaming that his crown was filled with serpents. A month later, rebellion broke out. Coincidence? Maybe, but in a medieval mind, coincidence was just God's way of confirming suspicion. The Church, however, walked a careful line. While it accepted that dreams could be divine after all, the Bible is filled with prophetic visions. It also warned that they could be traps. The devil, they said, loved to disguise himself as an angel of light. A vision that seemed holy could lead a soul astray. So how could you tell the difference between a divine dream and a demonic deception? Simple. Only the devout could trust what they saw. Everyone else should assume the worst. There were dreams sent by saints, meant to inspire or warn. There were dreams sent by angels, shining figures who whispered in Latin or simply pointed to some mysterious object, a sword, a flame, a key. And then there were the darker dreams, the ones people called temptations of sleep. In these, the dreamer might find themselves lured into sin, greed, lust, pride. Monks wrote of waking drenched in guilt after dreaming of forbidden pleasures. Some believed these were tests, battles between soul and demon, fought in the secret chambers of the mind. The struggle was real, even if the battlefield existed only behind closed eyes. For peasants, though, dreams were simpler, more direct. A bad dream about a cow meant the animal might die. A dream of a wedding could signal a funeral. Seeing a river overflowing its banks meant trouble for the crops. In the medieval world, symbolism wasn't metaphorical. It was practical, predictive, personal. Dreams were used, the way we use weather forecasts or gut feelings as tools for survival. And yet, not all dreams brought dread. Some were sources of wonder, even joy. A mother might dream of angels guarding her child. A monk might see a vision of heaven filled with music so pure it made him weep in his sleep. Saints were said to appear to ordinary people, leaving behind signs, the scent of flowers, the memory of light. Waking from such a dream wasn't frightening. It was holy. You might even write it down and show it to your priest, who would decide whether it came from grace or indigestion. There were also those who claimed dreams gave them power. Visionaries, mystics, and prophets often described being visited at night by celestial messengers. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, claimed her visions came to her in half sleep, blazing with divine fire. Joan of Arc would later say the same, that the voices of saints spoke to her in the dark. For some, dreams were proof of holiness. For others, they were proof of madness. Theologians debated endlessly about what the soul did while the body slept. Some believed it travelled that in dreams, a person could wander the spiritual realms, glimpsing purgatory or paradise. Others argued that the soul stayed put, but received visions directly from God, like divine cinema projected onto the walls of the mind. Either way, no one considered sleep to be a meaningless void. It was a passage, a nightly journey through invisible worlds. But dreams were not all saintly light and sacred messages. There were also nightmares, literal night terrors, blamed on demons or restless spirits. If someone woke screaming, unable to breathe, it was said that a creature called a Mara had sat upon their chest. The Mara was an invisible being, female in most stories, who entered houses through keyholes or cracks. She pressed down on her victims, suffocating them while they slept. It's where our word nightmare comes from, not just a bad dream, but a visitation. People tried all kinds of tricks to ward them off. Some placed iron knives under their pillows, others drew crosses on the headboard. A few left small offerings of milk by the door, in case the Mara preferred dairy to torment. Science, centuries later, would call it sleep paralysis, that terrifying halfway state between waking and dreaming. But for medieval people, it was proof that the unseen world was real and very close. And yet, despite the fear, they couldn't resist the mystery. Dreams fascinated them precisely because they blurred the line between heaven and earth. A dream could ruin you or save you. It could reveal your secret sin or foretell a miracle. Every morning, as people rose from their straw and shook the sleep from their eyes, they carried fragments of that world with them. And in a time when life was short and uncertain, those fragments mattered. So imagine it now, the sky paling through your tiny window, your head still, filled with half-remembered images, angels with wings of fire, a strange river, a voice whispering your name. You don't know if it was holy or not, but you feel changed. You reach for your tunic, whisper a prayer of thanks or fear, and prepare to face another day. But before the sun climbs too high, you notice movement in the corner of the room, something stirring under the blanket. You lift it gently, expecting straw, maybe a cat. Instead, you meet a pair of glassy eyes, blinking up at you. It's not a demon, it's your bedfellow, the family pig, snorting softly in its sleep. Because in the medieval world, sometimes the strangest part of the night wasn't the dream, it was who or what you were sharing the bed with. When morning came to a medieval cottage, it didn't come quietly. You didn't wake to the sound of birdsong or soft sunlight through linen curtains, you woke to the snuffling, bleating, and clattering of animals. Because for much of the Middle Ages, your bedroom was their bedroom too. The medieval household wasn't divided by walls or privacy. It was one shared, chaotic organism, a jumble of humans, beasts, smells and noises, all trying to survive the same night. Let's set the scene. The house is small, one room, maybe two if you're lucky. The floor is packed dirt. The walls are wattle and daub, plastered with straw and mud. In one corner, a straw mattress lies half flattened from years of use. In another, the family's most valuable possessions, a few tools, a cooking pot, and a pile of firewood. Near the door, the livestock sleep not in a separate barn, but right there, breathing the same smoky air. It sounds bizarre now, but there was logic in it. Animals were warmth. A pig or a cow could raise the temperature of a small house by several degrees. Their breath, their bodies, even their manure radiated heat. In the depth of winter, that warmth could mean the difference between life and death. So when night fell, and frost crept across the thatched roof, you pulled the animals inside and thanked them silently, perhaps begrudgingly for keeping you alive. You can almost feel it, the faint steam of their breath fogging the air, the floor soft beneath your feet but uneven with straw, and the dull warmth that fills the space. Not comfortable exactly, but bearable. The family lies close together, half asleep, while somewhere near the door a sheep shifts, its hooves tapping gently. The pig snorts. A chicken, confused by the dim glow of embers, flutters to a beam and settles again. The household at night was alive in every sense of the word. The sounds, the smells, it was an orchestra of survival. The mix of animal musk and smoke became the scent of home itself. Children grew up thinking nothing of sharing their space with goats or dogs. They named them, talked to them, even fell asleep to the rhythmic chewing of a cow beside the wall. And while it might sound unpleasant to us, it had its comforts, the steady presence of another living thing, the reassurance of warmth in a cold, uncertain world. Of course, not every animal was a welcome bedmate. Chickens might be tolerated until they decided to announce dawn at 3 a.m. Cats were useful for catching mice, but they brought their own quirks, the scratching, the occasional theft of food, the mysterious glowing eyes in the dark. Pigs, however, were another story. They were beloved, clever, and extremely valuable, often the family's most important possession. A pig might live indoors not only for warmth but for safety. Losing it to thieves or predators could mean hunger in the coming year. So yes, sometimes the family pig slept by the hearth, snoring like an elderly uncle, blissfully unaware of its economic importance. In wealthier homes, animals were still close by, just better separated. Stables and barns adjoined the main house so that heat could flow through the walls. Servants often slept above, the livestock in lofts, their beds warmed by the animals below. In castles, dogs were allowed into private chambers to provide companionship and warmth. Some noblewomen even kept small lapdogs specifically for this purpose. They were called comforters, and not just emotionally. There's a record from the 15th century describing Queen Elizabeth of York sleeping with her little greyhounds curled at her feet. Meanwhile, her servants lay in rooms not far from the horses and chickens. The divide between luxury and necessity was thin. Everyone relied on the same principle: warmth is survival. But there were risks to this cosy chaos. Fleas, lice, and other pests didn't care about social class. They travelled freely between human and beast, turning every night into an itchy truce. Diseases, too, crossed that invisible boundary. Livestock carried infections that occasionally spread to their human companions, though people rarely connected the dots. When a child fell ill, the potter's cause was often blamed on bad air or divine punishment, never the pig snoring peacefully beside the bed. There were also superstitions about which animals could safely share your sleep. Dogs, for example, were seen as loyal guardians. A dog at your feet was a sign of divine protection, a living sentinel against evil spirits. Cats, however, had a more complicated reputation. They were both cherished and feared. Some believed a black cat could guard against witchcraft, while others thought the cat itself was a witch's familiar. Letting one into your bed could be an invitation for mischief or worse. And yet, despite the superstition, people couldn't resist them. There's something universal about that quiet, shared warmth, the same comfort people find today in curling up with a pet on a cold night. Even centuries ago, they felt it too, that silent understanding between species. We'll keep each other alive until morning, but imagine, just for a moment, what it must have sounded like. The night, thick with breath and snuffling, the faint rustle of straw, a child murmuring in half-sleep, the father's soft snore, the low hum of wind against the roof. Then, suddenly, chaos, a cow shifting too close to the fire, a pig squealing, a chicken flapping wildly in the dark. You'd sit up, heart pounding, reaching for the poker or a candle stub, praying it wasn't a fox or thief breaking in. In that world, every noise meant something. Every sound was a question. Are we safe? Are we warm enough? Will the dawn come? Over time, as towns grew and homes improved, the animals were slowly exiled. Barns became separate buildings. Fireplaces replaced open hearths. Chimneys drew smoke away. The home began to divide humans on one side, animals on the other. The line between domestic and wildlife hardened. But for many centuries, that line simply didn't exist. Still, even after the beasts moved out, their presence lingered in language and memory. Pigsty became shorthand for a messy room. Cow's corner referred to the warmest spot by the fire. Dog days were the hot, restless ones, when even the hounds refused to move. People had lived so closely with animals for so long that the rhythms of their lives, their habits, their noises became part of human culture itself. And maybe that's why, even now, when we tuck ourselves in beside a pet or listen to the low hum of breathing from another creature, there's something ancient about it. Some instinct whispers that warmth is not meant to be hoarded, it's meant to be shared. But of course, not every sleeper of the medieval night shared their bed willingly. Some did so out of discipline, not comfort. Far from the family cottage, in the cold, echoing dormitories of monasteries, another kind of night unfolded, one of silence, devotion, and self-denial. Because while peasants sought warmth, the monks sought something else entirely, purity through discomfort. If the medieval cottage was a chaos of warmth, life, and noise, the monastery was its polar opposite, a world of silence, austerity, and order. Here, sleep was not about comfort or family, but obedience. You did not rest for your body, you rested for your soul. And when you lay down on your narrow cot beneath the cold stones of a monastic dormitory, you were not retreating from the world, you were surrendering to God. The monastery at night was unlike any other place in the medieval world. The air was still, the silence absolute. The only sounds were the low sigh of wind through the cloisters and the faint flicker of candlelight on the stone walls. The monks had already recited their evening prayers, compline hours ago. Their voices had echoed in long, mournful chants, each note hanging like incense in the air. Now, one by one, they made their way to the dormitory, the shuffle of their sandals soft against the flagstone floor. The dormitory was a vast, echoing hall, often built above the chapter house or cloister to make it easier to reach the church for midnight prayers. No one had a private cell, at least not in the older orders. Privacy was considered a temptation, a gateway to vanity or sin. Instead, rows of simple beds lined the walls, each one exactly the same, a wooden frame, a thin straw mattress, a single blanket, and sometimes, if fortune allowed, a small pillow stuffed with hay. Imagine stepping inside. The air smells of dust, candle smoke, and cold stone. A few slivers of moonlight cut through narrow windows, illuminating the simple cots. The beds are arranged in strict symmetry, like soldiers awaiting inspection. Each monk removes his habit and folds it neatly at the foot of his bed, wearing only his rough linen undergarment to sleep. They lie down in perfect silence, not one word spoken, not one cough too loud. Monks were forbidden from chatting in bed, from laughing, or even from sighing too deeply. Every movement was meant to be deliberate, calm, and prayerful. The act of sleeping itself was a discipline. You didn't sprawl or stretch. You lay straight, facing heaven, as if already preparing for the resurrection. Some orders even instructed their members to sleep on their backs, hands crossed over the chest, the posture of the dead. The Benedictine rule, the most famous of monastic codes, set the rhythm. It stated exactly when monks should go to bed, when they should rise, and what prayers should frame their rest. They were expected to sleep only a few hours at a time, just enough to keep the body alive, not enough to indulge it. Too much sleep was considered sloth, one of the deadly sins. A monk who overslept could be punished with extra fasting or work. Even in the depths of winter, there were no fires allowed in the dormitories. Fire, the rule said, was a distraction, a luxury that tempted conversation and comfort, so the monks slept in the same cold stone rooms that froze their breath into mist. Some monasteries allowed fur-lined blankets for the elderly or ill, but most relied only on wool and faith to keep the frost from their bones. The morning chill was a test of endurance, a small suffering offered as penance. In the hours between compline and matins, the midnight prayer, the dormitory held its own strange peace. Dozens of bodies breathing in unison, the sound of rustling straw, the creak of wooden frames, and then, at the first toll of the bell, the peace shattered. Bong! The bell for matins rang through the stone corridors, deep and heavy, echoing like thunder in the bones. The monks rose instantly, no hesitation. There was no groaning, no 5 more minutes. Within seconds, the dormitory was alive with quiet movement. Habits were thrown over shoulders, sandals fastened, and each man filed silently into the cold, torchlit hall. They walked in procession toward the chapel, their breaths white in the dark air. The transition from sleep to worship was seamless, as if they had only been practicing for this moment. Their chants soon filled the church, low and haunting, rising up through the arches like smoke. To listen to those voices was to hear something between human and divine men, suspended in the timeless rhythm of devotion, half awake but fully present. But not all monks met the night with serenity. There were doubts, always. Some, especially the younger novices, struggled with exhaustion, hunger, and loneliness. It was said that the devil favoured the hours before dawn, whispering into the hearts of weary monks, tempting them with dreams of home, of warmth, of rest. They called this the nocturnal trial, a test of will as much as faith. Falling asleep during prayer was not just embarrassing, it was sinful. The sleepy monk was said to have let his soul slip into the devil's hands. And yet, even the most devout were only human. There are recorded cases of monks dozing during matins, their heads nodding in, rhythm with the chant. Others confessed to sneaking small naps in corners of the cloister during the day. The abbots understood they knew that holiness didn't always win against fatigue. Still, the rule was clear. Discipline first, comfort last. The physical layout of the dormitory itself was designed to enforce obedience. There were no partitions, no shadows where one could hide. The abbot's bed was often placed near the entrance, so that he could observe his flock. And if anyone needed to leave the dormitory during the night for any reason, they had to do so silently and with permission. Even the body's natural urges were subject to divine order. Despite the strictness, there was a strange beauty to it all. In a world full of noise, war, and chaos, the monastery offered something rare, an island of stillness. Sleep wasn't indulgence, it was surrender. The monks gave up their dreams, their privacy, their warmth, all in exchange for peace of soul. And though the rest of the world slept in confusion or fear, these men slept with purpose, believing that even their slumber could glorify God. By dawn, when the final bell sounded and the sun began to stain the stone walls gold, the monks returned to their cots for a short second rest. They had already prayed through the darkest hours, watched the stars fade, and sung praises to the first light. The rest of the world was just waking, but the monks had already lived half a day. Still, there was a tension beneath all that holiness, a quiet awareness that faith didn't make one immune to fatigue or loneliness or doubt. Every sigh in that dormitory, every whispered prayer before dawn, was a reminder that even the most disciplined soul could feel the pull of sleep like a tide. And outside the cloister walls, another kind of sleep awaited, rougher, more chaotic, and far less sacred. While monks rose at midnight to pray, peasants and travellers faced their own kind of awakening, one marked not by bells, but by the raw cold of the pre-dawn air. Because, when the holy bells of matins rang across the valleys, their echoes carried far beyond the monastery, into cottages, fields, and markets where ordinary people stirred in the dark, rubbing their eyes and preparing for another day's struggle. Outside the monastery walls, the world was still asleep, but inside, the bell began to toll slow, deep, and relentless. Its sound rolled through the cloisters, vibrating in the stone, echoing down long corridors and out across the sleeping countryside. It was the sound of obedience, the sound that tore men from dreams and dragged them back to devotion. It was matins, the first prayer of the day, and the medieval world's most sacred form of insomnia. There were no clocks on the walls, no alarm by the bed. The rhythm of monastic life was kept by the bell, the holy timekeeper. Every monastery had one, some massive and ancient, others small and cracked, but all of them governed the body and soul like a heartbeat. Its toll didn't just summon monks to prayer, it set the rhythm for the entire community around them. Farmers woke by it, beggars heard it, travellers marked their journeys by its distant peal. Imagine it, the sound drifting across the frost-covered fields just before dawn. A shepherd, half buried in his cloak, hears it faintly in the distance, a signal that morning is coming. A baker in the town stirs from sleep and stokes his oven. Even those who never stepped foot inside a monastery were tied to its bell, willingly or not. In a world without wristwatches or glowing screens, time itself was sacred and it was measured in sound. For the monks, that sound was both mercy and burden. The bell of matins rang in the dead of night, sometimes as early as 2 or 3 in the morning. The dormitory would explode into motion the moment the first note struck. Blankets thrown back, sandals slipping on cold stone, breath puffing white in the 5. Air, the body protested, but the soul obeyed. In silence, they filed into line and began the long walk toward the chapel. The corridors were black as pitch, lit only by torches sputtering along the walls. Their shadows twisted as the monks passed, dozens of dark figures gliding like ghosts through the halls. Some carried candles cupped in their hands, the flames trembling as they moved. Their robes brushed the floor, whispering in rhythm with their footsteps. The air smelled of tallow and cold iron, the faint scent of smoke rising from the torches. Inside the church, the chill deepened. Stone held the night's cold like a memory. The only warmth came from the small candles flickering before the altar points of light floating in the vast dark. Then, as the last monk entered and took his place, the chanting began. Low at first, almost like murmuring, Latin words, ancient and precise, rippling through the air in waves. The chant of matins was slow and hypnotic, designed not to stir the senses but to still them. The sound filled the space like water in a vessel, measured, controlled, eternal. To modern ears, it might sound monotonous, but to those men, it was the closest thing to the voice of God. Outside, the world was black and silent. The stars still burned overhead, and frost crept along the edges of the cloisters. Inside, the voices of the monks rose and fell, their breath steaming as they sang. No one spoke, no one looked around. Each man focused inward, the rhythm of the chant guiding his thoughts like a heartbeat. But it wasn't easy. Fatigue pressed against them like a weight. Eyelids drooped, hands trembled. Some monks fought to stay awake, whispering their verses mechanically, their bodies swaying slightly with exhaustion. A few closed their eyes for a moment too long, slipping into brief seconds of sleep before the next chant jolted them awake. To falter during prayer was human but also dangerous. Discipline was everything here. Still, there was beauty in that exhaustion, a kind of fragile holiness. These men, half frozen and half dreaming, stood between night and morning, singing the same words that had been sung for centuries. The repetition wasn't mindless, it was the point. To lose yourself in the rhythm was to lose yourself in faith. Each note was a surrender, each verse a step closer to humility. When the final psalm faded, the silence that followed felt almost alive. The monks bowed, filed out, and returned to their duties or, if the night was merciful, to a few more hours of rest before dawn. But even in that short return to bed, the rhythm of the bell lingered. It had marked them, reminded them that time did not belong to them, it belonged to God. For the peasants outside, those same bells carried a different meaning. They were not calls to prayer, but calls to motion. The first distant toll from the abbey was the signal that night was nearly over. In the village below, a few flickers of light appeared. As hearth fires were coaxed back to life, bakers, millers, and herders rose to begin the day's labour. Even those who cursed the sound couldn't ignore it. In a sense, every medieval life monk or commoner was ruled by the same iron tongue hanging from a tower. There were no quiet mornings in this world. The day began with noise, the bell, the cockcrow, the creak of wooden shutters. But before the full chaos of daylight arrived, there was a brief, eerie stillness that belonged only to the early risers. You could stand in the road and hear the echo of the bell fading into the distance, the last breath of the night retreating toward the monastery. And yet, not everyone welcomed that sound. Some feared it. The toll of matins, they said, was a reminder of mortality, each strike of the bell a step closer to the grave. Superstitious villagers sometimes crossed themselves when it rang, whispering small prayers of protection. Others believed that the bell's vibration could chase away evil spirits that roamed before sunrise. The sound wasn't just a measure of time, it was a weapon against the dark. Over centuries, that belief turned bells into sacred tools. Church bells were baptized, named, and blessed with holy water. They were said to speak the language of heaven, their ringing heard even in purgatory. To sleep through a bell, some said, was to sleep through a divine command. But think of the toll it took on the monks themselves, waking every night in the freezing dark, year after year. It wasn't just ritual, it was endurance. Sleep became a fragmented luxury, a series of small gifts offered between prayers. They lived half their lives awake when others slept, bound to a rhythm that was both holy and punishing. And yet, when the first light finally touched the horizon and the bell for louds, the dawn prayer began to ring, something shifted. The black sky softened to grey, the air filled with birdsong, and the monastery slowly came alive. For a moment, the world felt new again, washed clean by the sound of voices and the glow of sunrise on stone. Outside the cloisters, villagers stirred in their own small beds, unaware of the long night of devotion that had just ended. They stretched, yawned, and turned to face the fire, grateful for warmth, not holiness. The monks would soon join them in labour, tending fields, copying texts, feeding the poor. Their lives, divided by bells, flowed into the rhythm of everyone else's. Still, there's something haunting about that nightly ritual, men rising in the dark, singing to an invisible God while the rest of the world dreams. It reminds you that even in an age of hardship, people searched for meaning in the smallest hours. And as dawn broke and the bell finally fell silent, the monks closed their eyes once more, not in rebellion, but in brief mercy. Their second sleep, short and shallow, would carry them toward the rising sun. But while the faithful sought warmth in prayer, others sought it in company. Outside the monastery's stone walls, ordinary people feared something the monks were spared, sleeping alone. Because in the medieval world, solitude wasn't peaceful, it was dangerous. In our modern world, sleeping alone is often considered a luxury, the height of privacy and peace. You get to stretch, sprawl, cocoon yourself in silence. But for the medieval mind, the idea of being alone in the dark wasn't comforting. It was terrifying. Because night wasn't just empty, it was alive, and being left to face it alone was a dangerous, even unnatural, thing. The Middle Ages were a time when darkness was not merely an absence of light, but a presence in itself, a force. Every rustle outside the cottage wall, every whisper of wind beneath the eaves could be something more. People believed that demons, witches, restless spirits, and the souls of the damned wandered freely once the sun had gone. To sleep alone was to expose yourself to that unseen traffic of the night to become easy prey. That's why, as odd as it sounds to us, the medieval night was communal. Family, servants, and even guests often shared beds, not just for warmth but for protection. Sleeping beside another human wasn't only about comfort, it was about survival, both physical and spiritual. If one person stirred, the others woke. If something moved outside, someone heard it. There was safety in numbers, and that safety wasn't taken lightly. Imagine a single-room cottage on the edge of a medieval village. The fire has burned down to red ash. The night beyond the door is black and endless. The wind rattles the shutters. Inside, the family huddles together beneath coarse blankets, parents, children, even the grandparents if they're still alive. A dog sleeps near the hearth, the family's silent guardian. The smallest child lies between the adults, both for warmth and for protection against the night's unseen dangers. To be separated from that circle of warmth would be unthinkable, to be exiled from both love and safety. For those forced to sleep alone, widows, outcasts, travellers, or servants relegated to distant rooms, the dark carried special anxieties. People told stories of spirits who visited solitary sleepers, of witches who slipped through cracks in the door to sit upon their chests, of incubus demons that sought the lonely. A person who slept alone too often was even viewed with suspicion. Why, people wondered, would anyone choose solitude when everyone knew what lurked in the dark? In towns and manors, the fear took subtler forms. Servants often slept in the same room as their masters, sometimes even at the foot of the same bed. It was practical if danger came. Someone could raise the alarm, but it was also psychological. A sleeping household needed to feel alive, occupied, guarded. The idea of empty rooms, of silence stretching through the corridors of a great house, was unnerving. It invited the imagination to fill it with ghosts, and the medieval world had plenty of ghosts to choose from. The dead, they believed, often wandered at night, souls trapped in purgatory, begging the living for prayers. Some appeared to warn of danger, others sought vengeance or forgiveness. Sleeping alone left you open to their visitations. Many people slept with a rosary in hand or a crucifix beneath their pillow, a small shield against the invisible. Even monasteries, for all their discipline, understood this primal dread. The monks might sleep in rows, separated only by a few feet of air, but they still slept together. The sound of another's breath, even the slow rustle of fabric, offered reassurance. In the dark, the smallest noises became proof of life, anchors against the abyss. But outside those sacred walls, fear of solitude shaped everything about how people built their homes and lived their nights. Cottages were small, not just from poverty, but from instinct. Close quarters meant warmth, safety, and companionship. If you were lucky enough to own a bed, you filled it. Children, guests, servants, all piled in together. The more bodies, the less silence. And silence was dangerous. The fear wasn't only spiritual, there was also the very real terror of physical attack. In rural areas, bandits, wolves, or even wandering soldiers could descend on isolated homes. Having others nearby meant witnesses and help. Even in cities, sleeping alone in a rented room was a gamble. Fires were common, thieves even more so. In a shared bed, you had at least one ally who might wake you before disaster struck. To sleep alone, therefore, became associated with vulnerability. Widows and single men were pitied or pitied with unease, their solitary beds seen as invitations for misfortune. The night, to them, wasn't a time for self-reflection or peace. It was a test of endurance, a long negotiation between fear and fatigue. There's a famous 14th century account from a woman in Norfolk who confessed to keeping a candle burning through every night after her husband's death. "For I may not sleep," she wrote, "for the voices in the dark do trouble me." The voices, she believed, were the dead, her husband among them, calling her name from the other side of the shutter. Whether from grief, imagination, or something else, she never again slept in full darkness. Candles themselves became a kind of spiritual company. The small flame, flickering through the long hours, symbolized not just light but presence, a reminder that something, however faint, was awake with you. People who feared sleeping alone sometimes left their hearth fires burning low, believing that as long as there was fire, no evil could enter. The flame was both warmth and ward. But when the candle guttered out and the last ember faded, the night returned in full, heavy and complete. In those moments, even the bravest could feel the weight of it pressing close. Solitude wasn't a privilege, it was a punishment. Yet, there were those who sought it deliberately, hermits, anchorites, and holy men who saw solitude not as danger, but as divine testing. They isolated themselves from the world, sleeping alone in cells carved into cliffs or stone walls. To them, the darkness was a mirror. Every fear, every doubt, every whisper of the devil came to visit, and they faced it willingly. Some went mad, others found God. The line between the two was razor thin. Their writings speak of nights filled with visions, temptations, and voices, the very things ordinary people feared most. But for them, to face the dark alone was the highest form of faith. "In the solitude of the night," wrote one 13th century anchorite, "I meet both my demons and my Lord, and I know not which will win until the dawn." So for most medieval people, solitude remained something to avoid. To be alone was to risk being forgotten by the living and noticed by the dead. The warmth of another person beside you, the simple, human rhythm of breath and heartbeat, was a barrier against the supernatural and the unknown. When dawn came and the rooster crowed, breaking the spell of the night, families woke together with a sigh of relief. The danger had passed again. The world was safe, at least until sunset. But the story of medieval sleep doesn't end with fear. It turns, instead, to the strange shapes and positions people took to ward it off the superstitions of posture and body that governed how they rested. Because while they feared sleeping alone, they feared something else almost as much: sleeping wrong. After a lifetime of prayers, candles, and shared beds, the medieval sleeper had one more challenge to face: how to sleep. Because even once you had found warmth, safety, and company, your posture could still betray you. To lie the wrong way, at the wrong angle, or in the wrong direction was to risk illness, misfortune, or even death. To us, sleep seems instinctive. You just lie down and let gravity do the work. But in the Middle Ages, sleep was an art form bound up in medicine, superstition, and theology. How you positioned your body reflected not only your health, but also your soul. And for people who believed that dreams were divine messages and the night a battlefield for spirits, posture mattered more than comfort. Most people didn't lie flat. It wasn't just preference, it was fear. To sleep fully horizontal was considered perilous because it resembled the position of the dead. The medieval body, always frail, was thought to imitate what it anticipated. Lying flat, doctors warned, might invite the humours to settle and choke the sleeper's breath. Physicians of the time, following Galenic theory, believed that sleeping upright helped the balance of bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile circulate properly. So the typical medieval sleeper rested half sitting up, propped on pillows, blankets, or even wooden wedges. Beds were often built with a slight slope, the head higher than the feet. This, according to the logic of the age, allowed the vapours of digestion to rise gently from the stomach toward the head, where they could influence the dreams ideally for the better. It sounds absurd now, but remember, the same people believed the stars could diagnose illness. The upright posture had another benefit. It made quick awakenings easier. When your home could be invaded by thieves, fire, or the occasional rat the size of a small dog, you didn't want to be caught sprawling like a corpse. You slept lightly, your body ready to spring upright. Especially during the watch between first and second sleep, this half-sitting posture made it easier to tend to the fire, pray, or deal with whatever creaked outside. Of course, the poor didn't have the luxury of adjustable beds or soft pillows. For them, upright often meant leaning against the wall, a sack of straw or bundled cloak beneath the head. Travellers slept propped against tavern benches, or, if they could afford it, curled under their cloaks by the roadside, knees to chest, chin to shoulder, like animals hiding from the cold. In these positions, sleep came not as peace but as ambush, brief, shallow, and uncertain. But among the wealthy, the geometry of sleeping could verge on the ceremonial. Noble couples were expected to sleep side by side, but rarely touching, especially when dressed in layers of linen and wool. Some even placed a wooden plank or bolster between them to preserve chastity outside the sanctioned days of intimacy. Others, following older traditions, slept sitting upright in massive canopied beds, the curtains drawn tight to keep out draughts and curious eyes. Illustrations from the 14th and 15th centuries show married couples propped up like statues, their hands folded on their chests, gazing toward heaven even in slumber. It was less rest and more rehearsal. The sleeping body mirrored the sleeping soul, alert, restrained, disciplined. Monks were instructed to lie in similar poses, hands crossed as if already laid in a coffin. To sleep was to prepare for death. To wake was to practice resurrection. But superstition added a layer of strangeness to this pious logic. For instance, people believed that sleeping on your left side invited bad dreams and illness. The heart, they said, was burdened by the weight of the body, causing dark vapours to rise into the brain. Sleep on your right, and you encouraged good digestion, peaceful dreams, and moral purity. Sleep on your stomach, however, and you risked sin, both physical and spiritual. The position was associated with gluttony, lust, and, in some sermons, outright wickedness. Direction mattered too. Many people positioned their beds so that their heads faced east toward the rising sun, and by extension, the direction of paradise. East was holy. It represented resurrection and renewal. West, by contrast, was the realm of death and decay. To lie with your feet pointing west was an omen, the way corpses were positioned for burial. Even the most skeptical peasant avoided it, just in case. All of these choices, posture, direction, alignment, were acts of cosmic etiquette. You weren't just sleeping, you were aligning yourself with the moral architecture of the universe. And, beneath all of it, was fear. Fear of dying in your sleep. Fear of being taken by spirits. Fear of waking in the wrong world. Sleep, in the medieval imagination, was not rest, it was exposure. The soul, they believed, wandered freely during the night, slipping from the body and travelling into realms unseen. If you died while dreaming, your soul might lose its way back. This is why certain sleeping positions were thought to anchor the soul, keeping it tethered through posture and prayer. For people of faith, the last conscious thought before sleep was a kind of passport. Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. These words were said to protect the sleeper from demonic trespass and ensure that, if death came quietly in the night, it came with divine permission. Sleeping upright, facing east, with hands folded in prayer, it was all part of the same negotiation between flesh and eternity. Yet, for all their efforts, the body often betrayed them. Exhaustion, illness, or sheer discomfort could pull the sleeper into contorted shapes that defied every rule. There are records of confessors forgiving people for unholy sleep positions, as though turning over in your bed could offend God. Others told stories of those who slept like beasts and woke with ailments or misfortune. The superstition fed on itself. Bad luck justified bad posture, and bad posture foretold bad luck. Interestingly, these beliefs didn't fade with time. Even into the Renaissance, sleeping positions remained moralized. Physicians wrote earnest treatises about which posture best suited the complexion of the body, advising melancholic souls to lie on their right, sanguine ones on their left. The language shifted from divine to medical, but the fear remained the same. To sleep was to lose control, and the body had to be managed even in unconsciousness. Still, there's something strangely poetic in the image of a medieval household at night, every bed tilted east, every body slightly upright, as though the entire village were half preparing for Judgment Day in its sleep. The night, for them, wasn't just darkness, it was a dress rehearsal for eternity. But of course, eternity wasn't as tidy as a sermon. No matter how carefully they slept, the medieval world was haunted by something much harder to control the creatures that shared their beds without invitation. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were the true masters of the night, creeping through the straw, feeding on the living, and turning sleep into a slow torment. And so, as the candle burns lower and the last prayer fades, we move from posture to pestilence, from the holy geometry of the sleeping body to the crawling reality beneath it. For all the care medieval people gave to their prayers, their sleeping positions, and their nightcaps, there was one part of the nightly ritual they could never quite control: the uninvited guests. No matter how holy the sleeper, how carefully the bed was made, or how tightly the curtains were drawn, every bed in the medieval world was alive. Beneath the straw, between the sheets, and within the seams of blankets and clothing, an entire kingdom of crawling life made its home. To sleep in the Middle Ages meant to coexist with an army of fleas, lice, and bedbugs, the quiet, persistent enemies of rest. They were so common that they barely counted as a problem. They were simply part of being human. A nobleman scratching under silk sheets and a peasant rolling on his straw pallet fought the same nightly battle. In this, if nothing else, the rich and poor were perfectly equal. Imagine lying there in the dark, your body finally relaxing after a long day of labour. The straw beneath you crackles faintly, the last glow of the hearth fading into red embers. And then it begins that tiny tickle on your ankle, the faint crawl at your wrist, the invisible bite that jolts you awake. You scratch, turn, whisper a curse, and try to settle again. But the scratching never truly stops. These small creatures were relentless. Fleas thrived in the animal-filled homes of peasants, hopping from pig to child to sleeping dog with cheerful disregard. Lice clung to the seams of clothing and bedding, laying eggs faster than anyone could pick them off. Bedbugs, almost invisible, crept out from cracks in wood and walls to feed under cover of darkness. The warmth of a sleeping body was their invitation. Hygiene, as we understand it, didn't exist. Bathing was rare, and often considered unhealthy or immodest. Washing bedding was expensive, difficult, and sometimes impossible during winter. Straw mattresses were reused until they literally rotted, turning into nests of dust, insects, and decay. A household might air its bedding in the sun once or twice a year, spring and autumn, by dragging it outside and beating it with sticks. This ritual wasn't just cleaning, it was war. You can almost picture it, a whole family out in the yard, whacking their bedding in rhythm, while clouds of dust, chaff, and fleeing insects fill the air. Children squeal, dogs bark, and the smell of dry straw mingles with smoke from the cooking fire. When it's all over, the bedding looks the same, but at least for one blessed night, there are fewer bites. The wealthy, for their part, tried to fight infestation with refinement. Nobles stuffed their mattresses with feathers or down instead of straw, believing that luxury would repel pests. It didn't. In fact, the warm softness of feather, beds created perfect hiding places for bugs. Servants were ordered to beat the bedding daily with canes and hang sheets by the fire to smoke out the vermin. Perfumed herbs, lavender, wormwood, rosemary, mint were sewn into the seams of pillows and blankets. The idea wasn't to kill the insects, but to outsmell them. And yet, even royal chambers weren't safe. There are records of ladies in waiting, picking lice from each other's hair as part of their daily routine, chatting quietly as if shelling peas. Nitpicking wasn't an insult, it was an act of friendship. Monarchs and bishops alike scratched discreetly during council meetings. Even kings couldn't command their parasites to obey. The church, ever ready to moralize, found symbolism in this constant itching. Lice and fleas, preachers said, were divine reminders of humility. The noble who scratched was reminded that before God, all skin itched the same. One 14th century monk wrote that the flea is the preacher of equality, it spares no station. But even the most patient soul could only endure so much divine equality before resorting to more practical remedies. Remedies were many and bizarre. Some people sprinkled ashes or vinegar over their bedding. Others rubbed their bodies with garlic or smeared animal fat mixed with herbs. A few desperate souls even applied mercury ointments, trading one form of misery for another. More mystical methods included placing dried toads under the bed to draw out the biting spirits, or reciting charms like, "Flee, flee, fly away. God's light be with me, not with thee." The irony, of course, is that these same pests often carried the worst horrors of the medieval world: plague, typhus, and countless unnamed fevers. The Black Death, the most devastating epidemic in history, spread partly through flea bites. But even after half of Europe had perished, the survivors didn't stop sleeping with animals or straw. Life simply had to go on, one scratch at a time. Still, for all their suffering, medieval people rarely spoke of shame when it came to pests. It was simply reality. They laughed about it, wrote jokes about it, even included fleas in love poems. In one bawdy 14th century verse, a lover compares himself to a flea that dares to go where I cannot, crawling over his beloved's skin without rebuke. What we see as filth, they saw as inevitable intimacy with life itself. The pest problem wasn't confined to homes, either. Inns, monasteries, and hospitals were infamous breeding grounds. A weary traveller might lie down in a strange bed and wake up, crawling with reminders of hospitality. In some towns, inns advertised fresh bedding, which meant, at best, that the straw had been replaced sometime in the last month. There were even lawsuits over bedbug-infested lodgings, though one suspects the plaintiffs rarely won. And then there were the lice of pilgrimage. Pilgrims walking to holy sites across Europe carried their infestations like badges of honour. Their clothes swarmed with what they called God's little soldiers, tiny companions on their road to redemption. Some even joked that the more lice one bore, the more sins were absolved. Faith and filth walked hand in hand. In art, these tiny invaders sometimes appeared as symbols of the fall, the physical proof of humanity's corruption. In reality, they were simply the background hum of daily life, like hunger or cold. No one truly escaped them, not even the dead. Chronicles describe plague pits crawling with fleas, still feeding on the corpses long after the souls had gone. The insects, indifferent as ever, continued their work. So imagine, if you can, what it was like to lie there at night in that world. The flicker of candlelight trembling on the wall, the faint scratch of straw, the small, maddening itch that never really stops. You shift, scratch, sigh, whisper another prayer, and try to sleep again, knowing full well that your bed is as alive as you are, and yet somehow They did sleep, every night, because exhaustion always wins. The body, after all, has its own mercy. It forgets. The itching fades, the mind drifts, and for a few brief hours, even the most uncomfortable sleeper found peace. But peace was fleeting. Because the medieval world was full of small torments, and not all of them crawled. Some came from the air itself, the cold that bit harder than any flea, the draught that crept through cracks like a ghost, the reminder that night always ends the same way, with the slow, soft extinguishing of the candle. And as that final flame sputtered and died, there remained only the darkness, the eternal night that would one day claim them all. Yet before we let the light go completely, there's still one last flicker left, the moment when the medieval world finally exhales and sleep gives way to dawn. Because even after centuries of superstition, fear, and restless, scratching, humanity still searched for one thing: peace before morning. The candle is nearly gone now, a trembling stub surrounded by a small puddle of wax, its light flickering like the pulse of something fading. For the medieval sleeper, this was the most fragile moment of the night, that final breath of light before total darkness. Once the candle went out, the world disappeared. The room, the bed, the fire, even the walls around you dissolved into nothing. You were alone in the black, with only your thoughts, your faith, and your fears to keep you company. People in the Middle Ages lived in a relationship with darkness that we can barely imagine. The night wasn't simply an inconvenience. It was another world entirely, one that belonged to God and ghosts, saints and sinners, the living and the dead. The candle's flame, small and defiant, was a bridge between those worlds. It offered just enough light to make the shadows move and breathe, and when it finally died, dark reclaimed everything. Most families could afford only a few candles per week. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, burned fast and smelled faintly of smoke and grease. Beeswax candles were precious, smooth, clean, and expensive, reserved for churches or the rich. For ordinary people, light was something to ration. A candle might be lit only during prayers, childbirth, or sickness. The rest of the time, the hearth fire served as the only glow, so when someone did light a candle, it carried meaning. It was a promise, a protection, a small act of hope against the vast uncertainty of the night. Mothers whispered blessings as they struck the flint. Travellers carried candles in lanterns as charms against evil. And at bedtime, when the last flame was finally blown out, it wasn't done carelessly. The moment was ceremonial, quiet, deliberate, almost holy. Picture it. A small room, its air thick with smoke and straw dust. A man sits at the edge of his bed, the candlelight trembling across his face. His family is already half asleep behind him, bundled beneath their rough blankets. He leans forward, shielding the flame from a draught, and whispers a final prayer. Guard us this night, O Lord, and wake us to thy mercy. Then, with a breath, he extinguishes the light. Darkness blooms, complete and immediate. The only sound is the faint crackle of the hearth and the steady rhythm of breathing. For a few seconds, his eyes strain, trying to find the outline of the familiar, the curve of a wall, the shape of a child's sleeping head. But soon, the darkness settles like water. In that world of black, there is no past or future, no class or status. Kings and peasants sleep under the same invisible sky. The same stars, unseen behind the roof, burn silently over them all. It's tempting to romanticize this moment, to imagine it as peaceful as simple life lit by simple light. But it wasn't always serene. Darkness was a constant hazard. A single spark could start a fire and erase an entire household. Many families feared blowing out the candle too soon, afraid that evil spirits might slip in through the dark. Others feared leaving it lit, in case the flame turned from guardian to destroyer. The medieval night was full of contradictions like that. Light could save you or kill you, sleep could heal you or doom you, and faith could protect you or expose your doubt. In monasteries, the last candle to be extinguished wasn't always a human hand's doing. In some abbeys, a single flame was kept burning through the night in the chapel, the eternal light, representing the presence of God. Its glow filtered faintly through stone arches, a steady reminder that even in the blackest hours, some watchful eye remained awake. But for most of the world, once their candle died, there was no light left but the cold reflection of the moon. And yet, there was beauty in that surrender. Without clocks or screens, The night stretched wide, timeless. Sleep wasn't an interruption of life, but part of its rhythm, a natural tide that rose and fell with the dark. People didn't fight the night, they accepted it. They lived inside its boundaries, learning its moods. Some nights were gentle, with soft rain tapping the roof and embers glowing like eyes in the ashes. Others were terrifying, the wind howling, animals restless, shadows crawling in corners. But always, morning came. Always, the candle burned again. It's strange to think how utterly dependent they were on such small, fragile light. A candle wasn't just a tool, it was time itself. It marked the hours until dawn, measured the pace of prayer, and governed how long a story could last. Some people would carve notches into the wax to count time, each mark a rough hour. When the flame reached the final line, it was time for bed, no matter what you were doing. In that way, light became both comfort and clock, and when it ran out, it forced surrender. There's something poetic about that, isn't there? A life shaped by flame. A civilization that measured its nights not in minutes or hours, but in inches of wax. It's hard not to wonder what they thought about as the last glow faded. Did they dread the dark, or did they welcome it? Did they see it as an ending or as a kind of grace? For some, that final darkness was a rehearsal for the great one, the sleep that would not end. Death was everywhere in the medieval world, close and familiar. People saw in the extinguished candle the image of a soul leaving its body, the thin curl of smoke rising toward heaven. To blow out the light was to acknowledge mortality, but also to trust that it would be reignited at dawn. As the candle dies, so shall the heart rest, one 15th century proverb said, and as the flame returns, so shall mercy. Even the language of sleep carried echoes of faith. To go to bed was often phrased as to lie in peace. To wake was to be raised. Every night was a miniature death and resurrection, the same story, repeated endlessly in every home and hovel until the very rhythm of it became sacred. And yet, beneath all the piety and ritual, there's something deeply human in that final act. The hand shielding the candle from the draught, the pause before the breath, the quiet relief when the darkness finally takes hold. For all their superstition and fear, medieval people knew something we've forgotten, that rest requires letting go. So as we leave them, these weary sleepers, these dreamers wrapped in linen and smoke, the candle's last light trembles one final time. The flame flutters, bends, and vanishes. The world exhales. Outside, dawn waits just beyond the horizon, hidden but certain. The roosters will cry, the bells of matins will ring again, and life will begin anew, the endless cycle of fear and faith, night and day, sleep and waking. But for now, the candle burns low. And for one moment, the entire world is silent, as if even time itself has finally closed its eyes. In the weird ways medieval people slept, we journeyed through the strange and fascinating nights of the Middle Ages, a world where people didn't sleep in one long stretch, but in two sacred halves, where straw beds, nightcaps, and barnyard bedmates were part of nightly life, where prayers guarded the soul from demons, and even the position of one's body could determine one's fate. We explored how monks turned sleep into devotion, how villagers feared solitude, and how fleas ruled as the era's most democratic companions. Every candlelit night was a balance between comfort and faith, fear and endurance, proof that even in a time of darkness, humanity always searched for warmth, meaning, and rest. If you enjoyed drifting through this quiet corner of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next candlelit story. Every episode of Candlelit History made to soothe, intrigue, and gently carry you through time, one whispered tale at a time. Your support helps keep this small flame burning, allowing us to bring more forgotten worlds to life. So, we'd love to hear from you. What should we explore next? Do you want to wander through ancient Roman dreams, Victorian sleep paralysis, or perhaps how sailors slept beneath roaring waves? Leave a comment below and tell us what chapter of the past you'd like to drift into next. Your ideas shape where we travel, and together, we'll keep the candle glowing one story closer to the dark, one step nearer to dawn. Thank you for watching, and may your dreams be gentle tonight.